Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Sutton. I'm an assistant professor of education at Pacific Lutheran University, and I'm the co-chair of the Common Reading Program. Today, we're really lucky to be speaking to Mr. Elmer Dixon. Mr. Dixon has dedicated his life to civil rights and social justice issues. In 1968, while still in high school, he co-founded the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party and went on to serve as a chapter field marshal. He remained active with the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party into the 1980s by sustaining the party's breakfast program and health clinic. After earning a degree in public administration, he now works as a trainer and consultant in the areas of multicultural communication, team building, and conflict management. We're speaking to Mr. Dixon today to gain more insight on his story and on the role the Black Panther Party played to sustain and support Black communities in Seattle and across the country, and especially to kind of dig into ways that there's overlap between his story and some of the passages that we read in The Hate U Give. So I think I can speak for all of us at PLU, Mr. Dixon, when I say it's an honor to speak to you today.
Thank you, it's my pleasure. I just wanted to make one kind of correction to the introduction. And as you introduced me I've spent most of my life fighting for civil rights. We never considered ourselves fighting for civil rights. We were always fighting for human rights, which is a broader path, a broader swath. Often when people look at the civil rights movement, which I don't consider we were a part of, we were an extension of that and took it to, I believe, a broader context. Civil rights were really in response to the injustices in the United States, primarily in the South, but across the U.S., and were largely in response to the Jim Crow laws in effect in southern states vividly, and also in effect across the United States more discreetly. But the right to sit on a toilet or sit in a cafeteria or a lunch counter, drink out of a water fountain, ride a bus, those were kind of laid the foundation for the work that we did. But we were looking for something a little broader, and I'll share that when we get to that point as we address your questions.
So how did you get involved in the Black Panthers? You and your brother, from what I read, started the Seattle chapter. So was there like a pivotal moment, or was there something that happened, or something that you experienced that inspired you and your brother to start the chapter?
Yes. Well, there was an accumulation of things, and there were two pivotal moments in my life, and I know one of them, in fact both of them were probably the same for my brother Aaron. But growing up in the 1960s, we grew up in the era of assassinations. My parents, of course, had voted for, I don't know if I should say of course, but they voted for John Kennedy, and we knew about Kennedy and the excitement that was building around him when he was elected in 1960, only to see him assassinated in 1963. Medgar Evers was assassinated around that same time. Shortly after that, Malcolm X was assassinated in 65. In between that time, between his assassination and MLK's assassination in 68, and Bobby Kennedy's in 68, the civil rights movement was boiling over. I remember vividly seeing the mothers and fathers crying and screaming after their daughters were blown up in the 16th Street Baptist Church. And so all of these things were images, the Bloody Sunday and the Freedom Riders, all of that stuff we saw on TV. It seemed like nightly there was some occurrence. And so, these things we were drenched in that reality. My parents had us march with Dr. King when he came to Seattle in 62 or 63. And so my brother actually had a conversation with Dr. King. I don't remember having a conversation with him, but I remember being there at that march. And so that was kind of the lead up You know, the insurrections in Detroit and Watts were very vivid, as we were seeing these things unfold. But I didn't have any particular political inkling as a young teenager, as a child growing up. It's just these things. These were the events of the day, and this is how life was unfolding. I mentioned that my two best friends were white, and in fact, there was a competition between them to see which one was my best friend. And the crazier one actually was my best friend, David Booth. And I would go on trips with his family. And I remember very distinctly, that I had this path laid out for me in terms of what I was going to be when I grew up. My father used to always challenge us and say, "What are you about?" And he'd make us tell him what we were going to do in life, or what we were doing, what we were becoming. And there was a seed planted in my head when I was very young. In fact, as early as 2 years old, because my grandmother, who on my mother's side, who could pass for white and did pass for white, and she was born and raised in Mississippi. And her mother, who died when she was 6 years old, fell in love with a guy we suspect was from Germany. He was not from the United States, and so that love affair was taboo. He ended up being sent out of the country, and my great grandmother died shortly thereafter. And but being a very light-skinned woman who could pass for white was not unusual in Mississippi or other southern cities, because to have a black woman or a black person who was that light complected, because of the history of rape and abuse by slave owners throughout slavery. Her grandmother, who raised her, was born in 1861 or 2, and I remember talking to her when I was a teenager, 13. She lived to be over 100 years old, and she told stories of hearing people in the house crying when Lincoln was shot. So she was born a slave, her grandmother was. And so my grandmother, then, having been raised in that, and then migrated to Chicago during the Great Migration, and my grandfather, her husband as well, born in Mississippi, he was very dark complected. And so during the Great Depression, she, unlike many people, black people, could get a job because she could go downtown and work and pass for white, and she did in a restaurant. She had a job in a very fancy restaurant, while my grandfather worked on the railroad. He too had a job, but she, the restaurant she worked in was patronized by these wealthy doctors and lawyers and businessmen. And so she had it in her head, of her 4 grandchildren, she chose me because my mother had left me with her when I was 2 to have to move to Champaign with my older brother Aaron, my older sister, who's the oldest, Joanne, because she was pregnant with her 4th child, my youngest brother Michael. And we were a handful to handle. So at 2 years old, she left me with my grandmother in Chicago. And my grandmother, starting that early, planted in my head that when I grew up, I was going to be a doctor, because she had seen the lifestyle that these doctors had, and how they were admired and respected. And that was what she chose for me. She chose a profession for each of her grandchildren, but she put the doctor on me. And she also told me that, I remember her telling me that when I was a little bit older, she told me not to get married. She said, "You're going to be a wealthy doctor." And I grew up with this image that I was going to be a rich playboy doctor. In fact, I had plans for attending the University of Hawaii, where all the beautiful women were, that I would want, while I was becoming this wealthy surgeon or whatever it was I was going to become. So, I mean, that was kind of like in the backdrop of my head as I was growing up. And then all of a sudden, in the spring of 1967, this cat by the name of Stokely Carmichael, who was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, SNCC was its acronym. And SNCC was doing organizing in the South, along with the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, organizing voters, black voters, and aiding in the freedom rides, getting white freedom riders from the north through the south to participate in the civil rights movement. And right around, and of course, if you're familiar with Dr. King's philosophy of when someone slaps you on the cheek, offer them the other cheek. Well, there was another cat that had come along by the name of Malcolm X, whose philosophy was one of self-defense, and who said that if someone strikes you upon the face, strike them back. And there was a guy by the name of H. Rap Brown who had become the most recent head of SNCC, who had a famous poster in his image with him holding up a match, a lit match that said "Burn, baby, burn," and that was shortly after the Detroit insurrections. And Stokely followed on the heels of H. Rap Brown, and so Stokely came to Seattle to speak at Garfield High School, my high school. I was a junior at that time, and my brother and I said, we got to go hear this cat. We heard some things about him, so we went down. We couldn't get into the gymnasium because it was an overflow crowd. I mean, hundreds of black people from all over Seattle, young people, came to hear this guy Stokely. And I remember very distinctly him saying that the reason why black people will have no freedom is because you don't love yourself. And he said, you hate the fact that you're black. And he started reeling off these different analogies, the fact that every connotation about black, the dark night, the dark of night, angel food cake is white, devil's food cake is black. The good cowboy wears white, the bad cowboy wears black. The good knight rides a white horse, the bad knight rides a black horse. And he gave several of these analogies. And I remember leaving there kind of stunned, but thinking to myself, well, I don't hate the fact that I'm black, but I recalled, however, that on the playgrounds growing up, including across the street at Madrona Park, where I grew up, that if someone dared call me black, those were fighting words. Anyone call you black, he was like, what do you mean I ain't black? And then those were fighting words. You'd go to blows over someone calling you black. And that was because we had been, throughout our history, not just black people, but white people have, throughout our collective history, have grown up with this fear and this negative connotation of blackness, maybe not realizing to the extent that it affected the psyche. But if you look closely at American slavery and the enslavement of black people in this country, and people will tell you all the time, as I hear conversations about reparations, will say, well, you weren't the only ones enslaved. The Jews were enslaved, and people throughout history were enslaved. The difference is that black people were dehumanized more than any other culture, to the extent that if you look at the images of black people in old cartoons and movies, it's of this black, dangerous, even Africa was called the dark continent, the black, dangerous individual. And so that's why on the playgrounds, of course, when someone dared call us black, we would be fighting. So as I remember sitting on the tennis court, because the playfield, Madrona playfield, had tennis courts, and I grew up playing tennis along with my brothers and my sister and people in the neighborhood. We were all, pretty good tennis players. And I was sitting on the tennis court shortly after this, maybe that summer, early in the summer, and I was reflecting on what he had said. And I recalled our tennis instructor one year. Her name was Miss Sullivan. She was a white undergrad student who had volunteered for the summer at our park. And she taught us the finer points of tennis, playing tennis. And all of us loved Miss Sullivan. She was pretty and she was smart, and she gave us her all, and, teaching us how to play tennis. And that summer, we won all of our tournaments and won the right to go play for the city championship, the Park City Championship. And the event was being held at the Seattle Tennis Club. Now, if you know anything about Seattle, the Seattle Tennis Club is down in Madison Park, in the ritzy neighborhood of Madison Park, on the waterfront, and Black people were not allowed at the tennis club. Now, Miss Sullivan knew this, and she took us down there, and we had on our little white shorts and our little white shirts that said Madrona Park on it. And we went in, and they had us sit in the cafeteria. Now, we were the only ones waiting in the cafeteria. And we didn't know why. So we were cool, looking around to see if there was something that we could eat. And then walks this tall Black guy, thin, and he's in his kitchen whites, ready for work. And he sees us sitting there, and he comes over to us and says, "What are y'all doing in here? Y'all better get into the back and get your clothes on." Because he thought we were the kitchen help for some event that may be coming up, maybe even for that tournament. And we said, "No, man, no. We're playing tennis." And he was like stunned. Oh, I was like 13, 14 years old. He was stunned. And so time came, we went out and we played our tournaments and we won them all, and we won the city title. And then when it came time for us to get our trophies on the little stand that was out there on the tennis courts, there wasn't a dignitary, a tennis official in sight. They had all left and just left our trophies there for us to pick up ourselves, because they weren't going to award the city championship to these Black dudes and little boys and girls on their lily white tennis courts that we weren't supposed to be playing on. So Miss Sullivan held a little ceremony and gave us our trophies. But I remember, reflecting back on that. And there were other things that I reflected back on that gave me pause. And that was that first seminal moment, that first moment where, as young people say today, I was awoke. My brother and I, as everybody in Seattle and across the country, started growing their afros out. And that was the beginning in Seattle of the "I'm Black and I'm Proud" movement. That was the early beginnings of the Black Power movement. And it was spreading across the country. And so I was entering in my senior year at Garfield. And I was appointed the co-chair of the Seattle chapter of SNCC. And my cohorts, there were 4 or 5 of us. One was a young woman by the name of Kathy Jones. And interesting thing about Kathy, she could pass for white, but if you dared call her white, it was the opposite. If you dared call her white, those were fighting words. And so she was part of our group. And we went to school. When I went to school, rather than wearing my jean jacket and my jeans and my no socks and penny loafers with the penny in it that I had been wearing up until that point, struggling to find my identity, I was in dark pants and a dark blue navy jacket that had SNCC on the back, as did the rest of my cohorts. So it was like a switch from night and day from my junior year to my senior year. And so we decided that we wanted and needed a Black Student Union. My brother had already been organizing the Black Student Union with Larry Gossett at the University of Washington. He was a freshman at the UW. And so we decided we wanted the Black Student Union. And the principal refused to give us a charter, refused to allow us to become a recognized organization on campus. And so we began to protest. And so because I was kind of I was in a position to be the focal point, I kind of led the disruptions, because I was in what was known as the stage band or the jazz band, which played for the pep assemblies. So when the pep assemblies on Fridays, I don't know if they still do pep assemblies in schools, but all the students are crammed into the auditorium, and I'm down on the floor in the stage band, When it came time to stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance and play the Star Spangled Banner, I refused to stand and I refused to play. So I got kicked out of school. And my cohorts were in the stands doing the same thing, sitting down. But I got kicked out of school because everybody can see me. So my dad had to get me back in school. And so the band director told me, look, Elmer, if you're going to be in the jazz band, you have to play. You know, you can't not play your instrument. So I said, fine. So the next pep assembly, I played the Star Spangled Banner seated. He couldn't make me. So this is long before Colin Kaepernick was even born. I played the Star Spangled Banner seated, and I got kicked out of school again. So we did a series of these things, and so eventually we decided to call a all school boycott. No one go to class on this particular day. And so I know the administration have gotten wind of this, but they probably figured that, you know, there's going to be a handful of black students that aren't going to go to class. You know, we'll send them home and then everything will be fine. But what they forgot or didn't realize was all of those, not only black students, because the school was about 55% black, but all of the white students, the Asian kids, the Latino kids, we had all grown up with. We'd all gone to school together since grade school. So when we called the boycott, nobody went to class. And the hallways filled up. And I don't know if you know Jonathan Bridge, who is the son of Ben Bridge, the popular jeweler Ben Bridge in downtown Seattle. Jonathan was an honor student. And I used to tell you, I mean, like 4.0, I used to tell this story and I say the only kids that went to class that day were the honor students. And John stopped me at one time and said, no, I didn't go to class either. So that was pretty much most, if 90% of the school, I guess. And so we ended up getting our BSU. A few months later, there was some uprisings at Franklin High School, a sister high school. A young woman had been sent home by the vice principal because she had an afro. And the vice principal told her she could come back to school when she had an appropriate hairdo. A couple of other black kids had gotten kicked out of school when they were in fights with white kids, and the white kids were sent back to class and they were sent home. So they had had enough, and they contacted myself, and they contacted my brother and Larry Gossett at the UW, and they wanted us to come down and meet with them and help them figure out a strategy. So we went down there one afternoon, we met with them, they laid it out, and we said, okay, that's it, we're going in right now. And we sent Kathy home, because Larry will tell you this in his story, that Kathy had promised promised her mother that she wouldn't let her get arrested. So Kathy had to go home. And so we went in and we took over the principal's office, the administrative office at Franklin, and kicked them all out. And we ended up staying there overnight. The next day, when the phone rang, we answered it as if we were running the high school. Hello, this is Franklin High School. Well, it was the principal telling us that he had given in to the demands and that please could he have his office back. So we left. It was about a week later when I was in my geometry class and the phone rang. And it was the front office wanting me to come into the office. And so Bob Narramore, my teacher, my geometry teacher, told me, Elmer, they want you in the office. I said, okay, what again? And so I got up, left my books, stepped out of the room. And as soon as I stepped out, there were two detectives there waiting for me. They read me my rights and put me in handcuffs and led me quietly out of the back of the school. And I was being arrested simultaneously with another student at Garfield at the time, Clifton Wyatt, the two students at Franklin, my brother, Larry Gossett, Carl Miller, EJ Brisket, four guys at the UW. They were being arrested. They all went to jail. The rest of us went to juvie. And within the hour, I remember looking at the TV set and MLK had been assassinated. And so, however it worked out, they were rounding us up. I don't know if they had heard that he was assassinated. We hadn't heard it yet, but they got all of us off the street before anything broke out in Seattle. The leaders got them off the street. So I was in juvie that day. And that evening when my parents picked me up, they picked me up. They were very solemn and very detached, very concerned. And the only thing they said to me was, "Are you all right?" And I said, I'm fine. And we drove home in silence as the nation was burning. And so a week later, we had been scheduled to attend the West Coast Conference of Black Student Unions at San Francisco State University in San Francisco. And we had to get permission from the judges, our various judges, to leave the state, and we did. We took a caravan of 3 cars down to San Francisco. And that night, that Friday night when we got there finally, the keynote speaker was none other than Bobby Seale, chairman of the Black Panther Party. And Bobby gave the most fiery speech that I had ever heard. And you know, he was very angry, very upset, talked about blood running in the streets. And the reason why he was so upset was because 2 days after MLK was assassinated on April 4th, on April 6th, the first member to join the Black Panther Party, little Bobby Hutton, 16 years old when he joined the party, was shot in the streets of Oakland by Oakland police by 30 police bullets. And he was in a gun battle with Eldridge Cleaver, who was wounded in that exchange, and little Bobby was murdered. And so this was after they had come out to surrender, and little Bobby was stripped down to his shorts. Eldridge was stripped down naked and had told little Bobby to strip down naked so they couldn't say that he had a gun, but he was not going to expose himself that way. So he went out in his shorts, and when he stumbled out with tear gas in his eyes, after beating Eldridge to the ground, they pushed him forward, and one of the cops said, "He's got a gun," and they just all opened up and slaughtered him in the street. And so Bobby was very mad, and he talked about revolution, and you could see the line drawn in the sand with all those students that were there attending that conference. You know, the line that said, are you not afraid? Are you ready to die? Or are you scared to death? And 90% of them were scared to death. Well, the small group from Seattle, my brother, myself, and several others, we made a beeline for Bobby Seale and told him we wanted to start a chapter of the Black Panther Party. He told us to come to little Bobby's funeral the next day. And the next day, when we were driving into West Oakland across the Bay Bridge, I saw hundreds of Black people, you know, in leather jackets and berets. When we got into the church at the end of the ceremony, because we couldn't get in because of the overflow crowd, to see, to file by little Bobby's coffin, I remember seeing the coffin as I was walking into the church and lining the inside of the church on the walls all the way down in St. Augustine's Church, were young Black men and women in leather jackets and berets with bandoleros across their chests and with shotguns. And I remember thinking, my God, this looks like a Black army. And as I got down to the front of the church and little Bobby's coffin was draped in a Panther flag, I remember looking into the coffin and looking down at little Bobby. And he was in his uniform, his leather jacket, his beret, his free Huey button. Huey was in prison, in jail at the time, awaiting trial to be charged and ultimately convicted for the death of a police officer so that he could be in the gas chamber, which he later beat those charges. But I remember looking down at little Bobby and thinking, that could be me lying in that coffin, because little Bobby was 17 at the time, and I was 17. That was the other pivotal moment. That for me was there was no turning back. My life was committed and given to the revolution. And as I said earlier, the revolution was not about civil rights. It was by achieving, attaining, and getting our God-given rights by whatever means necessary. And that was the pivotal moment. when I saw little Bobby lying in that coffin.
Mm. Wow. That's an incredible story. Absolutely incredible. And I've lived in the Seattle area for 25 years, and I've never heard that part of Seattle's history and how the Black Panther movement in Seattle came about.
We were the first chapter the first chapter organized outside the state of California, and the third chapter overall. When we organized that summer, Bobby came up to Seattle 2 weeks later. We met in my parents' house. There were probably 60 or 70 people in my parents' living room and dining room. My parents, when they got home from work, had to step over bodies and go back to the kitchen. From there, he went east and organized chapters all the way across the country. But we were the first chapter outside of the state of California.
So I'm going to assume that quite a few of our students may not be as familiar with the Black Panther movement or have studied it in depth. So, after you and your brother kind of decided in this pivotal moment that you were going to start the chapter in Seattle, I wonder if you could provide a little bit of background on what the Black Panther Party stands for or stood for, and some of the support they provided the Black community in Seattle and in different chapters across the country.
Yeah, well, there's a passage in the Bill of Rights that says that when governments constituted of men no longer protect and secure the rights of its people, and this is not verbatim, but you can look it up, that it is when that happens, it is the right of the people to abolish said government. We were at a point where we believed the government needed abolishing because of the murder, the rape, the brutality, the oppression that Black communities across this country had endured, and not only Black communities, but other communities of color, and including poor whites. And so it was a revolutionary movement that was started by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale to achieve and attain and create a political party that represented the rights of Black people. And that was in 1966 when Huey Newton and Bobby Seale organized the first chapter of the Black Panther Party. The symbol, the Black Panther, they chose for a very specific reason. There was another organization using that symbol in Alabama, known as the Lowndes County Freedom Association, also known as the Deacons for Defense, who had openly picked up arms to defend themselves against the white knights of the Ku Klux Klan and other racists who were attacking Black communities and defend themselves. And so Huey and Bobby approached them and asked them if they could use the symbol. And the reason why they wanted to use the symbol is because the nature of a Black Panther is to be defensive. It is not an aggressive animal. One of the biggest misinterpretations of the Black Panther Party is that we were the aggressors and that we were violent. We were anti-violence. We were pro self-defense. But the nature of a Black Panther is that, as long as you leave them alone and don't threaten their families or threaten their territory, then they're going to leave you alone.